Picture the mid-18th century, the Russian Empire, a vast expanse locked in a crystalline frost, lives by its own immutable laws. In this world of grand balls, lavish gowns, and gallant cavaliers, the name Darya Saltykova was a synonym for piety and high birth. A young, wealthy widow, a pillar of noble society, her life appeared to be a glossy portrait painted by a master European artist. But if you were to gaze upon this canvas more closely, you would see another image bleeding through the layers of gold and lacquer, an image that is dark, terrifying, twisted into a grimace of inhuman cruelty. The story you are about to hear is not merely the retelling of an old legend about a sadistic landowner. Together, we will conduct a true investigation. We will peer behind the sealed doors of her estate and into the darkest corners of a soul where nightmares were born. You will learn why the system turned a blind eye for years to the monstrous dramas unfolding, who finally dared to challenge this all-powerful aristocrat, and what secret springs moved the gears of this mechanism of evil. Prepare yourselves. We are about to rip the mask of respectability from one of the most sinister figures in Russian history. And the truth we uncover will prove to be far more terrifying and more complex than any fiction. To understand how one woman could transform her estate near Moscow into a private theater of horror, we must first leave her grim chambers and look at the world that created her. Russia, in the mid-18th century, was a colossus with feet of clay, a land of dazzling contrasts and irreconcilable contradictions. At one pole stood the glittering city of St. Petersburg, the new capital built on a European model, where the nobility spoke French more often than Russian, and the imperial court was a spectacle of unimaginable luxury. Here, the ideas of Voltaire were debated, Italian operas were staged, and portraits were commissioned from the finest artists in Europe. This was the facade of a great empire, its showcase, designed to prove to the world that Russia was a civilized and mighty power. But venture just a few dozen miles from the capitals, and this brilliant facade would crumble away, revealing a completely different reality, one that was archaic and brutal. At the base of all this splendor lay an unshakable pyramid, its foundation built upon millions of people without rights, the serfs. It is vital to understand that a serf of that era was not simply a poor laborer. They were living property, a christened soul, tied to the land and to their master. A landowner owned not only the fields, forests, and the manor house, but the very people who lived on that land. They could be sold like cattle, often tearing families apart in the process. They could be lost in a game of cards, given away as part of a dowry, or traded for a prize puppy. And this is not some artistic exaggeration, but a documented practice. The life, labor, and even the personal destiny of a serf belonged entirely to their master. Within the borders of his estate, the landowner was the judge, the lawgiver, and the executioner. His domain was, in effect, a state within a state, with its own unwritten laws. The power of a landowner was virtually absolute, limited only by his own conscience. And conscience, as we know, can be a very flexible thing. Darya Nikolaevna Ivanova, who became Saltykova by marriage, was born in 1730, at the very heart of this system. She was the daughter of ancient pillar nobility. Her lineage was distinguished and wealthy. From childhood, she absorbed the idea that the world was divided into two kinds of people: those who command and those who obey without question. She watched as her parents and neighbors managed their souls and saw that brutal punishment for the slightest infraction was the norm. The birch rod, the cudgel, the stocks, these were all part of daily life, routine instruments for maintaining order. At the age of 25, Darya was widowed, and this became a turning point. With the death of her husband, Guards Captain Gleb Saltykov, she was transformed from a woman living under a man's authority into the absolute mistress of a vast fortune. Hundreds of serfs across several provinces, the Troitskoye estate near Moscow, and a considerable capital, all of it fell under her complete control. In a world where a noblewoman was almost always under the guardianship of a father or husband, the status of a wealthy widow granted her a freedom and power almost equal to that of a man. And it was precisely this power, unlimited and unchecked, that became the poison that corrupted her soul. The system itself created the conditions for such tragedies. Any complaint from a serf against their master was treated as rebellion, an assault on the sacred right of property. Where could a person go whose back was flayed raw for a poorly washed floor? To the police? The local police chief was himself a nobleman and would sooner dine with the tormentor than listen to her victim. Submit a petition to the provincial government office. It would simply be rejected, and the runaway who dared to try would be returned to their master to be taught a lesson. This vicious cycle of impunity and fear allowed lawlessness to flourish behind the high fences of country estates for decades. What is most astonishing is that all of this was happening during the era we call the Age of Enlightenment, at the very time when Empress Catherine the Great, who ascended the throne in 1762, was corresponding with French philosophers about human rights and drafting her nakaz, a document proclaiming the principles of legality. A person in her own country could be tortured to death on the whim of their mistress. The story of Darya Saltykova is not just about one deranged aristocrat. It is a diagnosis of an entire society where declarations of humanism and justice shattered against the brutal reality of the absolute power of one human being over another. In 1755, when her husband Gleb Saltykov passed away, Darya was just 25 years old. For many women of her time, this would have been a tragedy, the beginning of a life of dependence on relatives. But for Saltykova, this event appears to have been something else entirely, the casting off of her final chains. While her husband was alive, her temper was likely restrained by the bounds of propriety, his authority, and the need to play the role of a respectable, noble wife. Now, she was the master of her own fate and of hundreds of other lives. And it was in that moment that a dark, destructive force began to grow within her soul, like a seed in a locked room into which air had finally been allowed to enter. No one could have suspected that behind the mask of a grieving widow lurked a personality ready to descend into an abyss of unimaginable cruelty. The mechanism had been set in motion, and nothing could stop it. At first, it all seemed like excessive strictness, a trait common to many landowners of the era. The house serfs and servants began to notice that their mistress had become incredibly demanding. Any trifle could send her into a rage. Poorly laundered linen, a floor that didn't shine brightly enough, a crease in a tablecloth. any of these could provoke a fury that was terrifyingly out of proportion to the offense. It started with shouting and slaps. Then came the birch rods, a common tool for educating serfs. But very quickly, the servants at the Troitskoye estate realized this wasn't about order or discipline. Their mistress was taking a visible, almost physical pleasure from the act of punishment itself. From the screams and tears of her victims, fear began to creep through the house like an invisible mold, seeping into the walls and into their souls. Every creak of a door, every summons to the master's chambers, made their hearts clench in a cold premonition of disaster. Why did this happen? What was the trigger that turned a wealthy aristocrat into a monster? Historians still cannot give a definitive answer, but one of the most common theories, whispered even by her contemporaries, points to a personal tragedy. Rumor has it that the young widow began a passionate affair with a land surveyor, Nikolai Tyuchov, the grandfather of the famous poet. Saltykova was madly in love with him, but he chose another woman, marrying a young maiden named Panyutina. It is said this betrayal dealt a terrible blow to Darya's pride. Rejected and humiliated, she allegedly tried several times to arrange for the newlyweds to be murdered, but her plans failed. And so, all of her unquenched passion, her resentment, her rage, crashed down upon those who were near and could not fight back. She developed a particular hatred for young girls and women, seeing in each of them a potential rival, a reminder of her own defeat. This theory, though never proven with documents, explains a great deal. Her cruelty was not random. It was methodical and had its favorite targets. It was the young maids, laundresses, and chambermaids who most often became the objects of her sadistic fantasies. The process of torture evolved into a kind of ritual. A punishment could last for hours. She didn't just discipline, she destroyed, slowly and with relish. Anything that came to hand was used as a weapon: hot curling tongs, rolling pins, logs from the fire. She might douse a victim with boiling water or force them to stand naked in the freezing cold. Her ingenuity in inflicting suffering knew no bounds. And the most terrifying part was that this was not a flash of blind rage. She often acted with cold detachment, like a researcher observing the reactions of a test subject. The home that should have been a fortress and a sanctuary was being transformed before their eyes into a torture chamber, and its mistress into a merciless warden. She was a god in this small world, and her wrath was like that of an Old Testament deity, irrational, all-consuming, and merciless. The mechanism of terror she set in motion at her Troitskoye estate operated on a well-oiled, almost ritualistic pattern. It would begin with a trifle. The offending girl, be she a laundress, a chambermaid, or a seamstress, would be summoned to the master's chambers. There, amid the elegant French furniture, silk wallpaper, and porcelain figurines, the first act of the tragedy would unfold. Darya Nikolaevna would begin with an icy, humiliating tone, methodically driving her victim into a state of animalistic terror. Then came the first blow. At first, it was with her own hand, but soon that was not enough. Any object within reach became a weapon: a log from the fireplace, a rolling pin for dough, a clothes iron. The grooms and footmen, strong men from her staff, were ordered to hold the unfortunate girl down so she could not flinch. It was a one-woman show, with Saltykova as both director and lead performer, and her staff as terrified extras, forced to participate in the nightmarish spectacle for fear of becoming the next victim. But her personal involvement in the torture was only the prelude. When the first wave of her fury subsided, Saltykova would order the ordeal to continue without her. The tormented person would be dragged to the stables or the cellar, where the punishment would go on for hours. They used batogi, thick willow rods that broke against human bodies, and whips with knots woven into the leather. She was particularly cruel to young and beautiful girls. Contemporaries whispered that the cause of this pathological hatred was a tragic love affair. Rumor had it that after her husband's death, Saltykova had developed a burning passion for the land surveyor Nikolai Tyuchov, the grandfather of the great poet. But he preferred another, a younger and more beautiful maiden, whom he married. This blow to her pride, it was whispered, became the catalyst that transformed her jealousy and resentment into a lethal hatred for any woman who reminded her of her rival. Every young peasant girl in her house became a living embodiment of her personal humiliation. She was not taking revenge for poorly laundered linen. She was unleashing upon them the full bitterness of her failed womanhood, the venom of a proprietress who had been denied something she considered hers by right. Over time, her ingenuity and torment reached monstrous proportions. She ordered victims to be doused with boiling water, their skin seared with hot curling tongs, their hair pulled until it tore away with the scalp. In the bitterest frosts of winter, she might order an offending girl to be stripped naked and tied to a post in the courtyard, or forced to stand neck deep in the frozen pond until she became a statue of ice. To Saltykova, a human being was no longer a human being. They were an object, raw material, for the gratification of her dark passions, a canvas upon which she painted masterpieces of her rage. Her estate, Troitskoye, located just a few miles from Moscow, became an isolated enclave of fear. Her neighboring landowners likely suspected what was happening, but preferred not to interfere. An unwritten code existed among the nobility. One did not air dirty laundry in public or meddle in another's affairs, especially when it concerned the management of christened property. Besides, Saltykova was not only wealthy, but also had influential relatives at court, which made her practically untouchable. The first tragic deaths were likely unintentional. A victim simply did not survive the torture, and their life was cut short. But after it happened once, then a second time, and a third, Saltykova understood the most important thing: there would be no consequences. The local police were in her pocket. For a small bribe, the district officer would turn a blind eye to any complaints. The local priest, who was required to record the causes of death, wrote whatever she commanded in the parish registers. From a fever, from a colic, from a sharp pain in the chest. And so, step by step, over the course of 7 years, from 1755 to 1762, she built a flawless system for concealing her crimes. Officially, her estate simply had an abnormally high mortality rate from disease. Unofficially, everyone knew that to be sent to serve in the house of Saltychikha, as she was known among the people, was a one-way ticket. Historians still debate the exact number of her victims. The official investigation files mention 38 proven cases where torture led to a fatal outcome. However, other data, based on complaints and indirect evidence, suggest the number could be as high as 138 people. Just think, In 7 years, one person took the lives of over 100 people, all in the very heart of the enlightened Russian Empire. The home that should have been a fortress and a sanctuary had become, for its inhabitants, a true hell on earth. It seemed this darkness would last forever, the tally of ruined lives endless. The system, built on fear and mutual protection, worked flawlessly, and any attempt at resistance was doomed. Complaints, if anyone dared to make them, drowned in the swamp of provincial bureaucracy, and the complainants themselves were returned to Troitskoye, where a swift and terrible retribution awaited them. This hopelessness paralyzed the will, turning people into docile slaves who prayed for only one thing: that the master's punishing hand would pass them by that day. But even in the deepest darkness, a spark can sometimes ignite a flame, and that spark came in the form of 2 men whose names history should have inscribed in gold in the book of the struggle for justice. Their names were Martynov and Yermolai Ilyin. They were ordinary serfs, not heroes or rebels by nature, but they had something that set them apart from the hundreds of other terrified souls. They had nothing left to lose. Each of them had drunk his cup of sorrow to the dregs. Saltykova had taken 3 of Martynov's wives, one after another. The first, the second, the third, each for one reason or another, fell out of favor and vanished into the grinding gears of their mistress's rage. He had watched the women he loved fade away from beatings and torture and could do nothing. He was a husband who could not protect, a man whose powerlessness was absolute. Yermolai Ilyin had suffered the same tragedy. His wife, too, became one of Saltychikha's countless victims. In their souls, where love and hope once resided, only cold ash and a dull, aching pain remained. And one day, that pain grew into something else, a cold, ringing resolve. They understood that silently awaiting their turn was no different from a slow suicide. And so, in 1762, they resolved to take a step that, by the laws of the time, was tantamount to sedition and rebellion. They decided to flee. Their goal was not simply freedom, which they might never have found. Their goal was St. Petersburg. They were going to attempt the impossible, to reach the very pinnacle of power, to break through all the cordons of officialdom and bring their truth to the ears of the monarch herself. Imagine their journey. It was not just hundreds of miles through the mud-drenched autumn roads. It was a journey through hostile territory, where any stranger could be an informer and any guard their executioner. They had no money, no documents, no influential patrons. All they had was the truth of their cause and a faint hope that somewhere in that glittering capital, a law existed that was the same for everyone. They walked by night and hid by day, eating whatever they could find or beg for. And then, ragged and exhausted, they finally reached St. Petersburg. But here, their greatest trial awaited them, the deafening wall of the state machine. Wherever they turned, their petition, scrawled on a scrap of paper, was met with smirks or indifferent shrugs. Who were they? 2 runaway peasants. And who were they accusing? Darya Nikolaevna Saltykova, a pillar of the nobility, a member of one of the most distinguished families in the empire. Their complaint was so monstrous that officials simply refused to believe it. Accustomed to bribes and flattery, they saw only 2 insolent troublemakers slandering their benefactress. Dozens, if not hundreds, of similar complaints from other serfs had already vanished without a trace into the archives of various government offices over the years. But Saltychikha and Yermolai had a stroke of incredible luck. Their petition, after passing through many hands, by some happy accident or an act of providence, landed on the desk of the newly crowned young Empress, Catherine the Great. And that changed everything. Catherine, eager to consolidate her power and cultivate the image of an enlightened and just ruler, saw a unique opportunity in this case. It was a chance to show the entire country, and especially the arrogant, overreaching nobility, that the era of lawlessness was coming to an end. She decided to use the Saltykova case as a show trial, a thunderous signal that from now on, not even the most noble and wealthy in her empire were above the law. The desperate cry of two simple men had finally been heard. The wheels of justice, creaking and slow, began their inexorable turn. Upon receiving the highest command, the state machine began to work with uncharacteristic speed and diligence. The Saltykova case was entrusted to the Senate and the College of Justice, the empire's highest judicial bodies. The direct investigation was led by men unconnected to the Moscow aristocracy, a measure intended to ensure their impartiality. But from the very first, the investigators were met with a solid wall of sabotage and conspiracy. Darya Saltykova, learning of the inquiry, did not sit idly by. She was confident in the impunity she had honed over years. She resorted to her proven methods: generous bribes to key officials, letters to influential relatives asking them to hush up the unpleasant affair, and the intimidation and bribery of potential witnesses. She acted with brazen self-assurance, believing that, once again, money and connections would solve everything. And at first, it seemed her calculations were correct. The investigators who arrived at Troitskoye were met with a conspiracy of silence. The serfs they tried to question were paralyzed with an animal terror. They saw the officials from the capital as temporary visitors who would come today and be gone tomorrow, leaving them alone with their vengeful and all-powerful mistress. People lied, equivocated, claimed to have poor memories, or simply repeated the same refrain: "I know nothing, I saw nothing." They understood perfectly well that a single wrong word could cost them their lives. Saltykova had been thorough. The most dangerous witnesses had been prudently sent away to her distant villages, while others had been frightened half to death. Even the Moscow governor, who had been tasked with assisting the investigation, was clearly dragging his feet, hoping the case would fall apart on its own. The investigation seemed to have hit a dead end. All the investigators had were the testimonies of two runaway peasants against the word of a respected noblewoman and the silence of her hundreds of serfs. But this time, the system failed her. The Empress's will was unbending, and a steady stream of stern directives arrived from St. Petersburg demanding the case be brought to a conclusion. The investigators were granted extraordinary powers. They were given the right to interrogate witnesses without the landowner's presence, guaranteeing their protection. A thorough search of Saltykova's house was conducted, where, according to rumor, they found secret torture cellars and account books with suspicious entries for funeral expenses for an unusually large number of young women. The most critical step was the decision to exhume bodies from the local cemetery to cross-reference them with the church records. And it was here that the lies began to unravel. The priest, who for years had covered up her crimes, cracked under the pressure of the evidence and confessed that he had recorded fictitious causes of death in the parish registers under the direct orders of his mistress. Gradually, seeing that the state was now on the side of the investigators, others began to speak. One by one, overcoming their fear, people told the monstrous stories they had held in their hearts for so long. The testimonies poured out, forming a single horrific picture. Details emerged that made the blood of seasoned officials run cold. They told of a girl who was doused with water in the freezing winter until she became a statue of ice. Of another who was beaten half to death and then buried alive in the garden. Of a teenage boy whose ears Saltykova had personally cut off with red-hot tongs. Each new testimony was another nail in the coffin of her reputation. The investigation lasted 6 long years. During that time, hundreds of people were interrogated and tons of documents were examined. The case grew to incredible proportions, exposing not only Saltykova's personal cruelty, but the rottenness of the entire system that had allowed it to happen. Finally, in 1768, the investigation was complete. The evidence was overwhelming. Darya Saltykova was found guilty. The sentence was delivered by Catherine the Great herself. She spent a long time studying the case files, and according to her contemporaries, was deeply shaken by what she read. The Empress understood that this was not merely a criminal case, but a political act. The punishment had to be not only severe, but also exemplary, a lesson to all. She overturned the initial verdict from the Senate, which had called for execution, and replaced it with something that, in the 18th century, was perhaps considered even more terrifying: civic death and eternal oblivion. On an autumn day in 1768, Darya Saltykova was brought to Red Square in Moscow. Once an all-powerful noblewoman, she was now placed on the scaffold like a common criminal. A plaque hung around her neck, bearing the inscription, "Tormentor and Soul Murderer." For an hour she stood there, chained to a post, subjected to the jeers and contemptuous glares of the crowd. It was a spectacle that Moscow would remember for a long time. After this public humiliation, she was stripped of her noble title, her family name, and all her property. From that moment on, she was simply Darya, daughter of Nikolai. Then, no longer Saltykova, but a nameless prisoner, she was sent to the Ivanovsky convent in Moscow. A special underground cell had been prepared for her there, a windowless, lightless chamber known as the penitential pit. There, in total darkness and solitude, she was to spend the rest of her days. Justice, though long delayed, had triumphed. Thus ended the story of Darya Saltykova, but not the story of her legacy. She spent 33 years in monastic confinement, 11 of them in that underground cell in pitch-black darkness, alone with her memories and, perhaps, her remorse. Later, her conditions were eased. She was moved to a cell with a small window through which curious onlookers could peer at the legendary man-eater, who had become one of Moscow's grim tourist attractions. She left this world in 1801, having outlived her courageous accusers and the empress who had condemned her. Her death was quiet and unnoticed, but her case reverberated for decades, becoming one of the most famous trials of the 18th century. It entered the history books as a precedent, a stark example that even in an age of absolutism and serfdom, the law, if backed by political will, could reach even the highest-ranking criminal. For Catherine the Great, the trial was a brilliant public relations victory, cementing her image as an enlightened monarch and a just judge. It showed the nobility that there were lines that no one was permitted to cross. However, it would be naive to think that one trial, however sensational, could change the entire system. Yes, Saltychikha was punished, but serfdom itself, the very soil in which such poisonous flowers grew, remained untouched. It would exist for nearly another century, and during that time, thousands of other lesser-known Saltychikhas continued to deliver their own justice and retribution on their estates, simply without reaching such a flagrant and theatrical scale. Saltykova's story posed deeply uncomfortable questions to Russian society, questions it could never truly answer. Was she a unique monster, a pathological exception to the rule, a mentally ill individual whose cruelty was the result of a sickness of the soul? Or was she simply the typical product of her environment, taken to its logical extreme, a creature of a system that handed one person absolute godlike power over the life and well-being of another and said, "Use it"? After all, if you strip away the extreme degree of her cruelty, what remains is a rather typical picture of life on a landowner's estate: arbitrary power, impunity, and a complete disregard for the human person. And this is the ultimate lesson of her story. Darya Saltykova is not just a character from an 18th century horror story. She is an eternal reminder of what a person can become when intoxicated by limitless power and convinced of their own complete impunity. It is a story about how easily the line between normalcy and pathology is erased when there are no external constraints, not the law, not public condemnation, not the voice of conscience. Her drama reveals how fragile the thin veneer of civilization and humanism truly is, and how quickly the darkest, most archaic instincts can break through. And of course, it is also a story about the incredible strength of the human spirit, about how, even in the most hopeless situation, when all seems lost, the courage and determination of two ordinary men, Martynov and Yermolai Ilyin, could set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to the triumph of justice. Their actions prove that the fight for truth, even when it seems hopeless, is never in vain. This story forces us to reflect on the nature of evil, the limits of human cruelty, and the responsibility that comes with any power, no matter how small. It reminds us that law and justice are not mere abstract concepts, but the only barrier separating society from chaos and tyranny. And as long as we remember this, as long as we value justice and compassion, we have a chance not to repeat the darkest pages of the past. The story of Darya Saltykova is not just a tale about the past. It is an eternal lesson for the future, one that remains relevant today.